we got in contact with a corporate VC of a big Italian bank who decided to invest. It took very long. I think between the time we got the term sheet and the time we got the money, it was like 6 to 9 months, something crazy. And actually, people ask me all the time, why did you start company again? And I'm like, I don't know, but I feel like I can do it. Like I feel like I have that positive thinking where actually all the things that went wrong will teach me to get it right. It would go well. We actually tried to really split decision making and manage the company in the different like areas, which actually helped with like the growth. But when things get hard, you need one decision maker. I believe this really strongly. So I still believe the 50-50 rule that a lot of VCs try to push is not the best, because I really do think that no matter what the decision is, there has to be somebody deciding when things get bad. Italian taxi drivers were pretty tough. I went through different tough times. We had like security. It was like a movie, but it was a bit crazy.
That's product market fit.
Product market fit.
Product market fit.
I called it the product market fit question.
Product market fit.
Product market fit.
Product market fit.
Product market fit.
I mean, the name of the show is Product Market Fit.
Do you think the Product Market Fit show has product market fit? Because if you do, then there's something you just have to do. You have to take out your phone. You have to leave the show 5 stars. It lets us reach more founders and it lets us get better guests. Thank you.
Well, Benedetta, excited to have you here on the show.
Thank you, Pablo. Great to have you to be here because I follow your show all the time.
That's great to hear. And you respond. I mean, the reason you came on, I mean, I posted about this. I've done quite a few now, like failed founder journeys, right? Like people who, like me, frankly, started a startup, got some amount of traction, but ultimately it didn't work out. And you reached out. And I mean, your story is pretty incredible. Like you had a kind of saving and investment app that you grew to like 500,000 users, 500,000 in revenue, 10 million raised, and still, things didn't work out. So I'm curious to find out all the ins and outs of that and what really happened. Maybe just for starters, like give some context. Like when did you start? What was the business and when did you start it? With who? Just all that stuff. So we have some idea of what's going on here.
Sure. So I actually started my career the traditional way, so in the big banks, and then moved to startups. When I joined Uber, it was a startup. It was like a Series A company. It was one of the first.
What year was this?
2012, I joined.
Wow.
Beginning 2013. So they had only 10 cities in the world when I joined. And so it was a real startup. And I saw the growth. And I spent there over 3 years and got to the point where I was co-managing Europe. And
did you start in the Bay Area or were you already in Europe when you started with Uber?
I was actually recruited to launch Milan, which was one of the first cities in Europe after Paris and London, because they're the like fashion cities. So Uber in the beginning was all like about the, higher end luxury driver. So that kind of industry worked very well. And it was an incredible experience. It really, you really saw what it meant to bring a company from very early on to sort of then have like processes in place and hiring people from the beginning where you have no processes and you just have to find ways to do things. And then when you're like hiring people and creating teams and you have to find ways.
And you were the GM at first, like GM in Milan, is that the role?
And then I became a regional general manager for Europe. So I did Milan and then Italy, and then I got a few other countries along the way.
How do you? Why do you leave? By the way, I'm always curious. Like when you're in that kind of a rocket ship, what makes you not just kind of stay there for as long as possible?
Because companies change, and I think the role changes a lot. And I think also in founder world, very few founders are able to move between being a great founder at seed and a great founder at Series B and C. And maybe this is also sometimes why companies fail. And this is given it's the conversation, but even in Uber, when I love when it's like you're building things, you're fixing things, you're like taking down fires. And when it's more about like one-to-ones and managing people and creating processes, is less of like what I like to do. And so I think I wasn't the right person anymore. We went from being like 5 in Europe to when I left, we were 1,000. So it's
Wow.
a very different company.
That's crazy.
Yeah. So yeah. And I think now when it's a public company, it's even a different job again. So
And did you leave Uber to start this company?
yeah, well, actually I left and then I was like, sort of, I need a break. I didn't know what I wanted to do. It was intense. Like there's a lot of stories. It's actually some of the stories of Italy are on the book about Uber, super pumps, and Italian taxi drivers were pretty uh, tough. So like I went through different tough times. We had like security. It was like a movie, but it was a bit crazy. So then I was like, okay, I need a break. I thought I would be a VC, so I kind of put my uh, foot and toe in there, and then I realized I wasn't ready to do it, the investment. I really wanted to start my own company, and that's when I started thinking about what I wanted to do. I have a background in finance. I've always loved regulated industries. That's why I really liked Uber as well. And so I decided to start a fintech. And I was approached by my other co-founders to start together.
How did you know them?
We just knew each other from startup communities. The US is different, but like Italy is such a small startup community that if you're in startups, you pretty know everybody in startups. We're still like a very small crowd. It's still a job that like your parents think you're unemployed when you say you're a startup founder.
And what year was this?
This is 2015, 2016.
Do they come to you with like an idea, like, hey, do you want to come with us and build this? Or it's just like they're starting to play around, trying to figure out what to build and driving you to figure it out with them, sort of thing?
Yeah, so I was already exploring things in finance and fintech. I really thought it was a place that it was going to start to grow a lot, especially with the, starting advent of apps. The idea was always to find things where you could democratize an industry that is really hard for people to understand. I've always found finance really easy. So for me, it was really exciting to be able to talk about stuff that people generally find complicated, right? When you talk about, like, I read a statistic that people don't understand percentages, so like,
That's
yeah.
surprising.
So,
What
yeah.
percent? What percent of people?
No, there's like, and then like something like 30% of Italians have really basic knowledge of like finance. And so they get sold really bad products, or they get all into these like saving accounts, which, at the time are very low interest rates. So it's not a great way to invest your money. So I was like, why don't I find something around this world? And that's how we came to think about the problem. We saw a little bit what was happening in the US, which is generally a faster market for many technologies. And so we thought, let's try and do something around wealth management in a bit of a different way.
How many co-founders were you?
We were 4, so we started as 3. One person was the product designer. One person was more on the like marketing side. I was more on a business side, and then we got a CTO. So we were 4. I think it's a lot of cooks in the kitchen, as they say. But yeah, that's how we started. We thought it would go well. We actually tried to really split decision making and manage the company in the different like areas, which actually helped with like the growth. But when things get hard, you need one decision maker. I believe this really strongly. So I still believe the 50-50 rule that a lot of VCs try to push is not the best, because I really do think that no matter what the decision is, there has to be somebody deciding when.
But did
things
you
get
have
bad.
like, were you the CEO, or who was the CEO who ultimately made the final decisions?
So I was the CEO, but I had the same equity as other people.
I see.
So nobody had majority, because when you split a company by 4, nobody had the majority. And as we grew and we got more money, our largest investor wanted us to be like, actually make a decision as one. So we couldn't like actually separate. So that made it really complicated. And that's when I started getting really interested also when I do angel investing in making sure like cap tables and contracts with investors are very clear, because when they are not, like, gets really messy.
So back to the idea, like what businesses do you see exactly in the US that you want to like emulate?
So there was Acorns, which was just starting, and then when we started, we saw there was another one called Stash Invest. I don't know if they're still around. The idea that we really liked and that we had in our head was that we wanted to do like the micro saving, micro investing. So the idea you could actually invest one euro without even thinking about it. And at the time, like fractional investing in ETF was really new. So we had to like think about how to do it. And then the idea was not only of just having traditional ETFs, but also having ETFs that followed certain themes. And that's what also Stash Invest was doing in the US. We didn't know they were doing it when we thought about it, but yeah, we kind of came up with the same idea.
And what's the step? What's the first step like with an idea like that has to go, consumer, has to ultimately get to millions of users? Like how much do you focus on the product versus, let's say, fundraising versus just launching an MVP? What's step one?
So I must say, like, actually the first investment we got was like a pre-seed on a deck. We got it really fast. So I never thought fundraising was hard from that moment. Actually, fundraising is really hard. But at that point, we got like like, I don't remember, it was like about 800,000 or a million.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Check, like off a deck in 2016. It wasn't like the bubbles of now, right?
That's right.
We were,
and in Europe, right? So which is also,
and in Italy, which is a tiny market, right? So
who is that from? Was that just an angel or was that a VC?
no, they were mostly like micro VCs, let's say, and angels. Yeah. This micro VC who did like a lead ticket, and then we closed with a few angels.
Was that based a lot on your back? I mean, I don't know what your co-founders' backgrounds were. Was that based a lot on your background with Uber, or what was the kind of thesis behind that round?
Yeah, definitely backgrounds of both me. My other co-founders had started another company before, so that kind of created a bit of credibility in Italy. So yeah, definitely it was mostly on background than idea, I think, because at the time we had nothing, and actually we spent, and this is something that I really like, that we spent a month kind of testing what we wanted to do by making people like because the idea was actually that you could, every time that you spent money, you could like actually, round it up and save a part of it. And we started doing this with like people sending us bank accounts, and we would round it up by hands and then do the movement. So like really manually, there was no app. It was, and that's a really good way of like testing product. Like I always think there's no reason why sometimes a non-technical founder wants to start something and they're like, oh no, I need to find like straight away a technical founder. And I think it's important to find technical people along the way, but you can test your idea any way possible. And
how did you do that actually? Yeah, how did you do that? Because especially with B2B, it's a bit easier, but with consumers, like how did you get a consumer to decide to send you? Did you know them, or these are just random people sending you?
We put our like LinkedIn out and said, you want to try this, be our beta tester, and then we would say, send us your bank statement for a month and we'll tell you how much you saved. And like, do you think it's like something we would use? So this was like the way. I mean, today you can do like an app or something, no coding, right? So it's a different time. But at the time, it was more about just creating like a community around what you were trying to do. And we spent a lot of time. And actually, I think this was our best success, was the community and content-based, community-driven acquisition that we did. So we really spent very little on, of that 10 million, which it was a problem. We spent very little on marketing because we had to, and then we'll get into it why. But like we spent a lot of time thinking about how to acquire customers very cheaply, and this was through community building. And it started from the really beginning when we didn't even have a product.
What
We
did you
had
like? Tell me more about community building. I mean, it's kind of a buzzword. You know what I mean? Like everybody, especially on consumer, wants to build a community. It's not really clear what that means or how you do it. What did you do, especially in those? Well, I mean, with money you can do a lot of things, but like in those early days, what did you do around community building that you think paid off later?
so a lot of it was about driving content around financial education, right? So making really, we started using Instagram to do like lives around like ask me anything about finances, and we would answer, and we would be there to answer. We always put our own face behind the app, so it wasn't you're talking to an app, but it was always us behind it. So we tried to make sure that you used our experience or brought in people who had experience that could like talk to our users. And we found that very often, in finance, there's these like pictures of the people in suits and that are like financial advisors, and nobody really resonates with them. So we tried and make like content by a similar person who was like, hey, I never saved before, I always struggle, I get to the end of my month without a money in my bank account, and this is how I'm doing it. And this kind of content really worked very well in driving people towards the community. We had a Facebook community where people would give us feedback on the products. And like it's funny because this is like nearly 10 years ago, and now there's so many tools to do all this kind of stuff. But at the time it was like Facebook community, a lot of Instagram videos, live videos, and really, really excellent customer support. So really being careful about having customer support. As founders, we always did customer support. I never stopped doing customer support in my companies. And I think it's really, really important, first of all, for the founder to know what's going on, but also to give a sense to your users that there's real people behind the app.
And then on, so you're doing this community building stuff, obviously in the background consistently. And then walk me through kind of the evolution of the product. Like the first one is just that test. How long did you run that test for? And what exactly were you trying, like what were you trying to get out of it? And what did you end up getting out of that initial kind of like, not even MVP, almost like pre-MVP phase?
So we wanted to understand really how much money we could make people save. So like how much should the rounding up be? Should it just be up to the euro, up to the €5, up to the 10? Like how much could we actually take away from people? And what kind of user was our first user, right? So how much did they really have on their bank account? What they were like, would they use the product? And we really started with a saving product first of all, because of regulation. You need to be regulated to do an investment product, instead of a saving product is non-regulated. And secondly, because it was an easier acquisition model, but very hard revenue generating model. So it's very hard to ask people to help them to save and then you charge them for it. So
Yeah, what is even the business model is there a business model for a saving product?
very hard one. So initially, honestly, this is also one of the issues and it was also a different time. But at the time, you always thought about like, I'm going to get a lot of users and then I'll figure out the revenue stream later once I have users. On a saving product is very hard. There's some companies who tried it with you pay like a monthly subscription for the use of it, but it doesn't really work because you're trying to help them save. If you make them spend to save, it goes away. So you can make money on the investment products, right? So every company that has a wealth management products makes a piece of a fee on helping you invest. And that's the basic AUM model, so assets under management model. So you take a very small percentage of the assets that people have with you, and generally they don't even notice if you're making them make money because it's just a little percentage of the whatever money they're making.
Now, in a sense, you already have like a roadmap, right, from these companies that are doing it in the US. Like, to what extent can you just look at what they did and just replicate it? And how much do you really need to test against your potential like different market?
First of all, there's regulation. The US has the advantage that with one regulation, you have 300 million people. And in Europe, every single country has its own regulation. And even if there's a concept called passporting, so you're regulating one country and you move to the other, you can't do that completely. Like you still have to have branches and change the way you communicate. Like there's all these different rules. So unfortunately, Europe is not a unified market, especially for regulated companies. And this is something that startups in fintech found out a bit the hard way. So they were trying to replicate American companies. And then you're like, okay, actually, my market is just like 60 million people, not like 300 million.
So the business models don't really translate because the TAM is just not big enough?
Yeah, correct. It takes a lot more costs to get the same TAM. And that's the first thing. Secondly, there's a higher aversion to investing in Europe than there. When I say Europe, I say like, let's say continental Southern Europe compared to the US. Like in Europe, most of the money is sitting in bank accounts. In the UK, there's what trillion pounds sitting in bank accounts. In Italy, it's something like 3 trillion euros sitting in bank accounts. People don't invest. And in fact, there's a lot of statistics that show that we're way less wealthy than Americans, because actually Americans, first of all, have a really successful, let's say, market. So if you just put your money in the S&P, it goes up and down, but over time it did very well. And instead, if you look at European markets, they don't go anywhere. And then Europeans are not really used to investing and taking risks. So there's a very low an aversion to risk taking. So this is the two things that didn't translate so well, I would say.
And so what do you end up deciding? Like, I'm curious, when you do decide to launch an app, like how much after that pre-seed round do you launch something, and what is kind of the first version of your app?
No, we launched it quite quickly, and we had a first version of the app that just did saving very simply. You could choose, and because we had a designer as like our one of our co-founders, I think we always led by design, and it was really easy to use. And so we tried to fit only one product inside it. We had this idea that you could save money also by doing things that were not financial to make it easier. So you didn't have to link bank accounts and all this kind of stuff. So you could save every time you did like 10,000 steps, because it was really easy to link other like good behaviors and like other apps to our app. So we decided to do this, and it was pretty.
So others would be paying for that, like for that behavior?
No, so we would take it out of your bank account, but if you behaved well, you kind of compensated yourself. It wasn't like a transaction where we had to read bank accounts, which some people weren't really comfortable with at the beginning. So we said, okay, let's say that you save every time you post on Facebook or post on Instagram, or every time you run 5K or whatever it was, that were like things that we could track of other apps pretty easy through APIs. And so it was an easy way to start. And that's what we started initially.
And how did that go? Like, how do you launch the initial product? You know, what does traction look like in those early days?
Yeah, no, we did a waiting list kind of model. So we sort of copied a little bit from a lot of markets. The waiting list did really well. The first day we had thousands of downloads, which was really exciting. We launched first only on iOS, then had Android a few months later. So the classical good initial testing of and launch of an app. Still no revenue. We just thought, okay, let's grow and get at the next round.
Which, by the way, like, I mean, you can make fun of it, but in a sense, it does make sense for, like, it has to kind of work at scale. Otherwise, you're not going to make money helping, you know, a few thousand people invest no matter what. So you kind of have to get mass market.
Yeah, for sure. And that's like, I mean, B2C fintech is big around that. Like, there's still like a ton of these very well-funded companies that still don't make any profits, you know.
And what were you seeing in terms of behavior, usage, retention, word of mouth? Like, what did that look like?
So we were lucky. We got quite a bit of press, so free word of mouth and etc. And the retention part was really interesting because people saved recurringly, right? So they just put and they forget about it. So
it was on
like,
autopilot, right?
Yeah, it's autopilot. So those things worked really well. And we had these cohorts where we would show how much people were saving, and every month it was increasing, and that was really good. Our cohorts were really working very well. but again, we had no idea how to make money out of these people. And so like we had to raise again. And when we decided to start fundraising, we got in contact with a corporate VC of a big Italian bank who decided to invest. It took very long. I think between the time we we got the term sheet and the time we got the money, it was like 6 to 9 months, something
Oh my
crazy.
God. How did you survive that time?
I know. You get very, very good at like not burning money.
How many employees were you then?
No, when we raised that, we were probably 10, 12, something like that. At the peak, we were 60 in the end. We were 60 employees. But yeah. And
that was what, by the way? What, like, how big was that? Was that a seed round? How big was it?
yeah, it was a 2 million, 2 to 3 million, 3 million. Yeah, like a seed. Yeah, 2, 3 million a seed round. And then we did 2 crowdfunding rounds, which did really well. So on this thing, we had quite a bit of users, and we did crowdfunding, which was really popular at the time. And B2C does really well generally in crowdfunding. And so we actually did a first crowdfunding where we raised like $1 million in like an hour or something like that. I mean, a year later, we had this idea to do the crowdfunding directly in our app to make it even faster. So we partnered with a crowdfunding platform and did an API, and so we could do.
And those crowdfunding was like they were buying like saves or equity. It wasn't like a Kickstarter where they were buying some product or something like that.
No, exactly. It's like equity. They would come into the equity with like sort of common, like a special type of shares, like that would be put together for all.
And so how much did you raise in crowdfunding across those 2 rounds?
Like probably we raised the first time 1.5, 2 million, and then the second one about the same. Yeah, we raised really well on crowdfunding. And it's also great marketing because you're always online. You're like, people are talking about you. It's like great marketing tool. But it also creates a lot of problems in the long term. We were contacted by the investment arm of the same like banking group, which was a different company, but still in the same group. And they invested like another 4 million. So by that is about 10 million. So they invested about another 4 million into
So this
us.
bank did like 2 rounds.
Yeah. So first it was the bank, and then it was their investment company, like the company that does the wealth management company. They're part of the same group. They're 2 different companies.
Over what period? That 9 million, like the first pre-seed round happened like 2016, but then over what period did all that other $9 million come in?
Up until 2020.
So like over a 3-year period, you're kind of raising like 2 million here, 4 million there, this sort of thing.
Yes. And then 2020, we were going to close a extension of the round I was talking about with the investment company. COVID hit. So actually, during the time of fundraising, we got all in a lockdown. And so obviously fundraising became very complicated. And we were like, okay, now let's count how much money we have in our bank and see what we can do about how long it's going to last. We don't know, right? Like, so I don't know if it's really hard, like difficult to think about it now because we kind of mostly forgot about it. But at the beginning, we had no idea what was going to happen. And obviously with our largest investor being a bank, they were like, oh my God, all our branches are closed. All our employees have they have like 100,000 employees in Italy. They didn't know what would happen. All the banking branches, they didn't know what would happen, etc. So it was a difficult time, of course, for us.
I'm really worried because listen, like you've been listening for like what, 10, 20, 30 minutes now. Clearly you like it. And the thing is, the next episode is way better and you're going to miss it. You're going to miss it because you're not following the show. So take your phone out and hit that follow button.
And what did the situation look like? Were you at peak like with 60 employees and what was your runway?
At the time, we had very few months of runway, like 4 or 5, because we were raising. And what happened was that we managed to get a couple of different COVID grants. Like they were not grants, but they were mostly like, debts instruments that various governments had that they tried to help startups and small companies sort of survive. So we managed to get a couple of those, and then we said, okay, we have a 12-month runway. And then the decision became very hard. And I have to say, like, when you look back at it, it always feels like you had obviously did a lot of wrong stuff. But when you think about doing in the time, it's really hard when COVID just hits. You're like, how can I get my employees to, we got the list of employees and we are like, how many should we keep and which ones are important? But then it was really hard to say, okay, now in this period where they are home alone, maybe away from home in a different city, they're stuck in their house, you even like fire them. Like, it's going to be really tough. And so we procrastinated and thought like it was going to go away and we were going to find funding. And so we started only putting people in sort of a one day a week less. So they got 20% less salary and 1 day a week less. And that was our initial, cutting costs move. Probably wasn't fast enough because it didn't like get our runway much longer. And at that point, we weren't doing much marketing. So it doesn't help because you're not growing as much. So you're not as attractive for VCs. And so that's kind of the place where you're at. You're a bit stuck. And that's where we were thinking about it. And so the thing is, failure doesn't happen between one day and the next. It happens over a long time. And actually, we talked about this, but it happens even after, like once the company is sold or shut down, it doesn't happen in a day. It happens in a very long time. So between that March 2020 and July 2021 was a whole period of time where we had to fight fires and shut down, and it took a long time. And sometimes you can do it a bit faster, but not that fast. And so that's how it's hard, because you're like failing every day.
What did you
not
end up doing? Like, you had 60, you cut down to 80% of those 60's time. And then when did you decide, okay, this is not sustainable, we need to go to, what did you do? Did you go to 30 or 20 or 10? Like, what did you end up doing?
Well, at a certain, so that was, I think we should have actually cut really early on in hindsight. And probably those people would have found jobs pretty quickly because they're talented. It's like talent. It's good talent. So it's not that it's that hard, or we could have supported them in the time to find jobs, even though you were a bit like, it was hard because nobody could go anywhere. But what we did was that we realized after a few months that we couldn't, like after the summer, we realized our runway wasn't getting better. And so we were like, okay, we have to have a different plan. So we sat down with the board and we were like, we need to sell. So we started going to a lot of other companies and trying to sell ourselves, which is very hard when you're like trying to get a decent price, but you're the one saying, I'm selling myself, like
That's right. Yes.
It's very complicated. So you try and do something where you're selling the people or you're selling the users, etc., while we were keeping the business existing, right? Because otherwise we had no asset to sell. So you had to keep the business running, and on the other side, try and sell yourself. And we tried that for some months. And one of the issues we had was because we were partnered with one bank, a lot of other banks were like, no, we're not going to take you. You have the legacy structure of this other bank who's like our competitor. So it became really hard to unwind all the technology developed to sort of integrate with this one bank. So one of the things that I learned, I would say, is never have like one supplier or one like infrastructure where you cannot take yourself out of it, because it can become really complicated.
Did you end up selling the business?
Yeah, we ended up selling. We decided to get a sort of a liquidator, it's called here, like where you, like a company that helps you do a whole like assessment of your assets and your liabilities. And then they try and sell off the assets of the company. So actually you don't sell the company, but you sell the assets of the
And in your
company. So
case, your main asset was what? Was the user, the user base, the app?
users, the app, employees, users, app, and also for financial companies is the actual license.
Mm.
So, and we tried to sell them all separately first, which actually could have been a better outcome, but it's really complicated to do it in a separate ways, because selling users, you need to find somebody who's already regulated to use, like to. So in the end, we bundled it all up and did like sort of a auction, so like a closed auction. So we found like 10 buyers, and we said, okay, everybody send the price, and we chose.
And who bought it ultimately? Like what kind of a business?
Ultimately, it was a brokerage company, and they had a private equity fund sponsor, and they thought it would be really good to combine the app with the brokering. So they already had all the investment products, and they could use our app to make better use of getting to B2C customers, in a more retail customers, in an easier way. Plus, they gained all our users.
And how much was it sold for?
I don't think I can say it. Very little.
But it was less than the total money raised, I would assume.
Less than the money raised. I cannot disclose. Yeah, so the investors got also nothing, because it was an asset sale. So you actually take the money and just pay the creditors. So the first people who get paid are all the people who gave us the loans and any creditors. So the employees, obviously, if they have any unpaid salaries and stuff, all your like suppliers, etc. And so managing also the communication to all the investors, considering we had thousands, even though in cap table they're one line, right? There's a lot of people who, many of them were also our users. So it created, so that kind of like community that is lovey-dovey, love your brand, making sure that they still love you and understand what's happening is really tough, because it's always retail. So like it's a very complicated communication to manage, in the same time when obviously the buyer didn't want us to discredit the brand, because they still wanted to have the clients. So it was tough, because then they were communicating like, oh, we have this new like Oval is relaunching and da da da, and in the other side the investors were like, what are you talking about?
They've lost all their money. Yeah, it's not easy. So walk me through something like I get all the logistical part of it, and obviously, COVID happened, fundraising got hard. There is an element of just kind of running out of cash, running out of time. But let's talk maybe a bit more just like about the business itself. I mean, fundamentally, you did have, like you said, 500,000 users, 500,000 in revenue or so at peak. Something was working, and yet, as much as COVID was painful, if things were truly working, generally speaking, you can find a way to fundraise. And frankly, the market came back, and all that stuff kind of came back in late 2020, early 21. What was happening in the actual business? Like, what do you think wasn't fully clicking?
Yeah, so I think that after the app was really working well, when we got the large banking partner, we spent most of the money developing product instead of developing users. So we spent a lot of the money integrating with the big bank, because we thought, okay, now they're going to use us to their users and it's going to be great. And instead it was like 2 years of like hiring a lot of developers to get like us on top of their banking infrastructure, which banks infrastructure is like so old fashioned. And I mean, that's why also new banks exist, but like they can't change those systems. So when you put yourself on top, you have to create a lot of technology to make sure the legacy technology works with your really fast technology. So things like they would like send us banks have this thing in Italy where they shut down for certain hours of the day. Yeah, they still like turn off like something which
For
in the-
maintenance or for what?
No, just every night. They have like a few hours where they're off. And like, if somebody did a payment, we wouldn't see it for a few hours for some weird reason. And they still do this in
what
certain...
motivated you? So it sounds like you went deep on this idea of a partnership, which I get the allure. Like a lot of times the big, in your case, a bank, but a big enterprise, they just have access to so much demand, so many potential users. They are like, Was that kind of the thinking, like, okay, let's do this because that's the best way to go to market versus what we've been doing so far?
Yeah, I thought like, we got to like, at the time we had like maybe 50,000, 100,000 users. What if we had 20 million, right? Or the bank was really scared because there were all these like new banks sort of popping up. And I was like, we can be their new bank. Like it could be actually a great exit strategy, right? And it happened that a few banks in like Spain actually bought apps that they had invested in. So it could have been a really successful, if you want, outcome, not maybe $1 billion company, but still like a good exit, right? Where you raise 10 and you sell for like 100 or something like this.
And through that makes sense. But then through that, let's say 2-year period, as you're realizing just how hard that is, I assume you had discussions about, well, maybe we should just abandon the strategy, go back to what we were doing. Like, how did that work its way out? Like, how did those discussions play out internally?
Yeah, so we had a lot of this discussion about like, why the hell did we get into this mess? But the problem is when you get the money from your partner, then you're kind of tied. So like the money is tied to the partner. And so they make also decisions. They had board seats. Like it's very hard to get out of it completely. We tried to reverse when we decided we would sell to make it easier to sell the company. And reversing was like, a 6 month project. So like you don't have the time to like reverse. Sometimes you're stuck in like a pie. And as you say, the allure of the big enterprises is always really, enduring. That's why they did all these CVCs where they invest and then they tell you they do all these things with you. And then one of the hardest parts is making sure you always have your kind of sponsor inside the big organization. Because until you have it, I feel like things are slow, but they go on. As soon as that person leaves, moves, goes to some other job, then you have nobody who's going to follow you. And for these big companies, even if they put like to get complex, they put maybe 6 million into us. For them, 6 million is,
Nothing. Yes.
nothing. So for them, it's so much easier to just say, let's get rid of 6 million than have to deal with it.
Do you think if you wouldn't have taken any of the bank money, that things would have played out differently, that it would have worked out?
So it is actually a really tough business model. But I do think 2021 was a great year for like looking back for all these like fintech. So maybe we could have had like some exit that wouldn't have been, we weren't. I think it would have been very hard for us to be a profitable company without some kind of exit beforehand. And I don't say just because I talk about myself, but I like learned about the industry while I was in it, right? You realize how hard it is. You look at all the other companies and they're still struggling to be profitable. So it's really also with much larger markets and AUM, etc. So it's a very difficult business model to get to work. And I think the tech side of it doesn't justify the multiples that like wealth managers have to have like 10 times those multiples.
Let me ask this maybe final question. I remember when I think back to my startup, which also didn't work out, you start off with almost pure excitement with just a little bit of fear. And then, if it's really going that way, you kind of go down this sliding scale. And all of a sudden you realize like you're more negative than positive on the potential. Like, when did that trip over for you? When you look back, when do you remember feeling like, yeah, you know what? I don't think this is gonna work out.
Do you know that actually I think I'm the most optimist person in the world. And I think that it actually felt harder in the beginning than later because I'm the kind of person who feels like energized by fixing things. So I was like, we're going to fix this. We're going to fix it. We're going to find a way. There's going to be a way. There's money going to come in. Somebody's going to buy us. And whenever we had like a call or like something progressing or a due diligence and whatever, and you would be like, okay, yeah, it's happening, right? So you always felt there was a way. And you're kind of like, I'm not going to let my baby, you know, not succeed. And so I never hit the point the hardest point was letting go of employees. That's where you say, okay, something went wrong, right? But other than that, I always thought there was a chance that we would make it. I really did. Like, because of crowdfunding, I had a lot of friends who invested also in the startup, which makes it even harder, because when you just have like VCs, like, they know the game, they know what they're doing. When you have a big enterprise company, they don't care if they lose that money. For them, it doesn't mean anything. But when you have your customers and your friends invested in your company, you always think in your head that it's going to work out. And actually, people ask me all the time, why did you start company again? And I'm like, I don't know, but I feel like I can do it. Like, I feel like I have that positive thinking where actually all the things that went wrong will teach me to get it right. And Travis, when I met him the first time, he told me that it was his third company and his first two had failed. And he said, in the US, it's not a problem. In Europe, saying you failed is like saying you do a startup is like saying you're unemployed. Saying you failed is like saying nobody wants to be with you, right? So it's like really tough as like something to talk about. But I've always tried to normalize it, because in my point of view, it actually helps me believe that it gets me one step closer to being successful.
I think that's the way you have to think about it. And it's interesting to hear you say that, because obviously this idea that you kind of never thought you would really fail, and you never wanted to, you were never like kind of just throwing the towel. I've heard that many times from founders where it ultimately worked out, and it's kind of easier for them to say. So it's interesting to hear from you. So final question, if you had to, and I heard you mentioned you kind of do angel investing. So obviously you meet with a lot of founders. Like, what's some of the most common, and taking everything that you've learned, like, what's some of the most common piece of advice you find yourself giving early stage founders?
So the most common piece of advice I give is to not think that the next money check is going to be there. So one of the first things angels like people do, and it's generally I've just invested in them, is they're like start hiring like 5 people, and they start like spending on marketing a lot, and they just start using the money. And especially in Europe, where there's way less money than the US, I think actually founders are really good at being smart about money. But then as soon as they raise, they kind of forget all about that and then start spending it really fast. And the first thing I usually do is I sit with the founder, and I actually send one of your podcasts about one of the
That's
founders
awesome.
who raised 4 million, and then he waited and he hired only 12 employees, and then he stayed there until he found the product market fit. And I tell the same. It's like you're raising in seed. You have no idea what you are going to go and where you're going to go. So just wait to spend the money. I know there's this idea that VCs want you to raise again in 18 months, but make yourself arrive to those 18 months where you know what you're doing with your company. And so that's the first advice I give. And the second one is, when you raise money, just make sure you raise it from people who you think you can help you along the way. Because money now, especially, is easier to find than people think. And so maybe be patient also with who you're raising money, because sometimes you'll get on your cap table people that will destroy your life. And I have so many examples of even smaller shareholders that make founders' life so difficult. So, now I'm like, people tell me, why aren't you raising yet? Like, I'm always like very slow at raising money for these 2 reasons. One, because I like to be thoughtful about how I use my money. And number 2 is because I really want to have people on my cap table that I believe can help me along the way. And I want to be able to say to them, I need help, and we can like build something better.
Well, thank you so much. Let's stop it there. Thanks so much for coming on the show and sharing your story so candidly. I'm sure it'll be very helpful for founders to listen.
Thank you so much for having me. I will share it along as well.
Wow, what an episode. You're probably in awe. You're in absolute shock. You're like, that helped me so much. So guess what? Now it's your turn to help someone else. Share the episode in the WhatsApp group you have with founders. Share it on that Slack channel. Send it to your founder friends and help them out. Trust me, they will love you for it.